Hello, welcome to our panel today, new data requirements, AI arts collaborations. We are hosted by the MediaFutures project today, and we're going to start with a little presentation about what that project is by Professor Elena Simpel, who is a professor of computer science at King's College London and also the technical lead of MediaFutures. I'll hand over straight to you.
Thank you. So now let's see if I can do that little trick again of sharing my screen. So we're seeing the screen now. So you should be seeing my screen now if someone kindly
looks good.
Yes, very well. So a warm welcome to this session also on my behalf. As Geffen explained, I am the technical lead of the MediaFutures program on behalf of King's College London. Well, our world faces many challenges. And in MediaFuture, we focus on those related to misinformation and disinformation online. These have been linked to all sorts of evils, to the rise of populism and its impact on democracy, on fairness, on diversity, filter bubbles, and their tendency to encourage extreme positions over time as people are not longer exposed to other people's opinions and viewpoints, as well as a diminishing public trust in facts and expertise on virtually any subjects, from vaccines and global warming to digital ID documents. None of these phenomena are really new, and some argue that the global crisis we're going through right now has only made them worse. At the same time, we in MediaFutures believe that there are several recent developments in technology and innovation in law and public engagement, which we believe are going in the right direction. So these are very exciting, very interesting times to try out something new, something different to tackle some of these common concerns. So who are we? We are an open innovation program funded through Horizon 2020. By virtue of being an open innovation program, we are not trying to find solutions to these challenges around misinformation and disinformation completely on our own. Instead, we are reaching out to the wider community through open calls, seeking solutions to relevant challenges. What is perhaps a little different than other related programs, including some of the data incubators and accelerator this big data community knows very well, is our transdisciplinary design, which brings together a whole range of disciplines and subjects and approaches in the services that we're offering, while at the same time acknowledging that we need to be diverse and inclusive in the choice of whom we support. So perhaps a little bit different than previous data incubators and accelerators, including some that I have led myself, we're not seeking out just entrepreneurs, tech providers, or data holders, but also designers, artists, and the public. So I'm going to spend a few minutes trying to explain why we designed the program this way and what we have learned so far. So there are several dimensions of the program that are basically just a direct function of the vertical we are addressing: online misinformation and disinformation. It is naturally linked to creative industries, in particular to media companies and social networks, but not restricted to it, because the role of these sort of institutions in anything from science education, high quality journalism, digital democracy, areas that have been disrupted by the rise of misinformation and disinformation, has been widely discussed. We also acknowledge the hugely valuable public service fact checkers and online activists and other programs are offering. However, we all are increasingly aware of the availability of such services, but their impact at scale remains quite limited. And in addition to that, many of the programs around bottom-up quality journalism, science education, and digital democracy, for some reason, prefer to build their own online tools and communities, possibly because this gives them more control over the design of the experience and how they handle the user data. But that means that they require quite a bit of upfront investment, and they often don't reach critical mass. In MediaFutures, we want to fund and support and work together with such programs. But we're seeking new approaches to fact-checking, to data literacy, to public engagement that are also mindful of concerns around new business models, global reach, diversity and inclusion, and sustainability beyond the funding that we are offering for the 6 months program. In MediaFutures, we have a very strong data and technology component. We equally acknowledge the role that these play in addressing several problems linked to mis and disinformation, from detecting deep fakes and moderating harmful content to delivering information that has perhaps less bias and partisanship. At the same time, we know from previous accelerators and innovation programs that there's various roadblockers to making the most of data and AI. To start with, access to data often involves a data holder willing to share the data for mutual benefit. We provide key data sets for everyone to use and advise and mentoring on how to create and share new data sets from text and from other forms of media. Furthermore, processing and making sense of the data, which often comes in large amounts and multiple modalities, requires advanced technical skills and computational resources, which are far from mainstream. And our training program and experimentation support addresses that. Equally, we know that the ability to use big data and AI does not always come with insight into the underlying cognitive or social societal limitations or into the broader implications of the technology. So in other words, we know that to tackle such complex problems, we can't be looking just for technology-centric approaches, because these will not deliver on their own, even if we give startups and other organizations access to data and algorithms. Some say we live in a post-truth society where jokes shared on social media travel faster than official statistics and solid research and proven records of expertise. We do experience a culture, a political culture, in which decisions and debate appeal first and foremost to people's emotions, reinforcing preconceptions in favor of actual data and policy details. And that, together with a fragmented and polarized public engagement and to our ever-shortening attention spans, means that we can't follow the same approaches to designing new solutions and innovate. What we need is something different, something that crosses across disciplines and experiences to entertain and to educate and deliver added value services and products at the same time. And that's exactly what we're trying to look for in MediaFutures. So we're not looking just for startups and SMEs, which have been the traditional recipients of open innovation programs in the past. We're looking for entrepreneurs and artists and their joint concepts and ventures as well, so that they deliver products and services and artworks and experiences that are interactive and participatory and ethical and equitable and use data and technology in ways that we couldn't possibly think about, but at the same time are able to speak to people and to reach them and have an impact. We know that to support this kind of approaches and technologies and experiences, we will need to tweak how we do open innovation. So the sort of traditional funding and skills and entrepreneurship models aren't really able to address complex questions on their own, though they do provide useful best practices, and we do build upon these best practices. We have 3 open calls. We have launched one last year and we plan another 2. These calls are organized around different types of tracks and around topical challenges. The tracks target startups, creatives, and collaborations between the two. So by design, we're looking for different types of organizations from all over the world, bringing together the experiences that we as the MediaFutures team have from working within BDVA and the STARTS program. Across these different tracks, we offer funding, we offer mentoring, we offer training, we offer bespoke support in a range of subjects, including but not limited to data science and AI. We're offering 80,000 euros, up to 80,000 euros equity free for startups and small and medium businesses, up to 40,000 euros for artists, alongside the range of services I've mentioned. The program is designed as a innovation funnel with 3 steps, and you see a screenshot here on the right-hand side at the bottom. So essentially, there is, once accepted into the program, there is a start phase of a month where the applicants receive seed funding to develop their original idea further. If they pass that first milestone, then they enter the main phase, which in MediaFutures is called Build, where for 5 months they realize that idea. And then the best in class, so to speak, are awarded prizes in the final exhibit phase at the end of the 6 months. To apply to the program, startups and artists need to address a particular topical challenge. And for the call in 2020, we have identified 4 such challenges. One of them is a general open challenge, where we're looking at creative and impactful ideas to tackle misinformation in general, whereas the other 3 are much more related to what is concerning us, or what was concerning us in 2020, which is the global pandemic. These 3 challenges were viral complexity. It was all about empowering people with new approaches, new tools, new experiences to data literacy. There was a challenge on building bridges, which was very much acknowledging the challenge around opposing view and polarization, and was looking for ways to build new connections rather than divides between different audiences. And finally, a third challenge around new mediators. We wanted to seek ideas and concepts to strengthen the role of trustworthy mediators to reduce misinformation and to help people find high quality information they need. So if you think about these 3 challenges, or about the open challenge more broadly, no technology can provide a credible solution that appeals to different parts of society, because we believe that all of them have to have the ability to engage with data across different social groups, across different communities, including those that perhaps are less represented online. So we were looking for ideas and concepts that give people tools and the opportunity to make sense of information, to question this information in various ways. So those were the sort of things we were looking for in 2020. In 2021 and 2022, we will be looking at other challenges, but the look and feel and of what we're looking for will stay the same. So we're looking less for startups that are promoting digital business models that depend on ads or on clicks or on going viral. We're looking for interactive or participatory approaches that are using state-of-the-art technology, but also multidisciplinary insight to make users feel included and empowered to create their informed narratives, to voice opinions with confidence and perhaps restore some of that middle ground we've lost. A final area where we had to tweak some of the existing models is how to measure the success of these programs. So in classical open innovation, we sometimes make assumptions and optimize for performance metrics that are not necessarily aligned with broader social, cultural, or environmental issues. We address this in MediaFutures by taking a much more holistic view to how we evaluate applications, including the composition of our panels, but also by putting a lot of effort into assessing our own impact and the impact of the organizations and individuals we support, which focuses not just on economic impact as it was traditionally done in the past. And the response so far has been really overwhelming, despite the unprecedented times we lived through. So for the first call, we had 133 applications submitted from 32 countries. And we've selected 7 startups in the startup track. Out of 61, we've selected 5 artists in the Artists for Media track out of 46, and 7 startup artist collaborations out of 27 submissions. The ideas that made it through had some commonalities. They did not try to solve complex societal issues with technology alone. They used a range of theories and insights from behavioral psychology, from neuroscience, from design, from environmental sciences, from media and arts to appeal to users and to the general public and have an impact. And we're trying to use data and AI responsibly and think about reaching out to new audiences by being open, diverse, and inclusive. And I would very much encourage you to have a look at the website under mediafutures.eu/projects to learn more about them. We as MediaFutures are very excited and very proud to work together with these pilots. But at the same time, we also understand our mission as a provider of open innovation services in this exciting space between tech and creative industries. And our aim is to support those who join our programs, but also the wider ecosystem, including digital innovation hubs. And I know many of them are here today at the or during the week at the event. So we're looking to support this ecosystem by producing resources which others can reuse. And that includes toolkits with best practices and lessons learned and data sets and digital methods for various types of audiences with different skills in data science and AI. The toolkit itself is not yet available because it does require us to gain more insight into the accelerator and the residency program, and we literally just started. So the build phase of the first cohort has started at the beginning of May. At the same time, we do have a first release of the data, methods, tools, and training portal, which you can have a look at. We very much believe that the approach we're taking to design innovation programs applies actually much more broadly than the vertical we are addressing. In fact, personally, I think it is a must if one were to tackle any sort of big global challenge, from going health pandemic to climate change and rising inequality. We hope that with the panel today, we will contribute to that conversation, and that in time, we will see more and more incubators and accelerators reaching out to a more diverse set of stakeholders and seeking new interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary solutions that borrow from the arts and from other disciplines, that embrace different ways to understand and measure their impact to make a real difference. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the rest of the MediaFutures team. Gefion is here, Hugh is here, and you will have the opportunity to meet Alexandra as well, the coordinator of the project, in a panel tomorrow. There's a whole bunch of us, including the University of Hanover, the coordinator, ourselves as the technical lead, Irkam, who's also on a panel, but also Zabala, who's running the Open Call, the colleagues from the Open Data Institute here today, who are also leading on a training program, colleagues from the Design Entrepreneurship Institute in charge of dissemination and assessing the impact of the program, colleagues from the NMA Accelerator in Germany providing expertise in media and entrepreneurship, as well as legal experts from KU Leuven, and experts in online participation from Eurecat, as well as misinformation from the Luiss Business School in Italy. Thank you very much for this, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them on now. Otherwise, you're going to hear more about the program during the panel.
Thank you very much, Elena. That was a great introduction. I've already said it on Whova. If there are questions, please drop them on the Whova platform and we will pick them up as and when we can. I would now like to move on to our panel discussion. Let me just give you a quick overview of who our panelists are today. We are very grateful to have them all. We have Hannah Riedler-Horth from the Open Data Institute, who is the director of the Data as Culture program. We have Dr. Melissa Mehta, who is the head of public policy at the Open Data Institute and also an expert in data ethics. We have Hugues Vinay, who is the director of innovation and research means at ERCAM and leads the artist residencies program at MediaFutures. We have Anya Catherine and Deja Tai, who are artists based in Los Angeles, who are currently participating in the first cohort of MediaFutures with their soft evidence program. And we have Matthew Pawlowski, who is an assistant professor of cognitive and neuroaesthetics psychology at the University of Vienna. And then we'll now give each of you a few minutes to introduce yourselves and your viewpoint based around the question of what are the potential challenges and potential solutions in bringing AI and arts together. Hannah, do you want to start?
Yes, so I'll just say a bit about myself. I've been working as a curator, commissioning artists to work on the intersection between science, art and technology for about 30 years. And Data as Culture has been running for 10 years. I joined the Open Data Institute nearly 8 years ago. And we commission artists to work with data as an art material and to critically and materially respond to data and network culture. So some of the projects we've done include DocsBox TrustBot by Alistair Gentry, which is a hot pink puppet robot, fake AI, and an online exhibition called Rules of Engagement, in which 3 artists, A.M. Dark, Nick Breeze, and Avarice Pitkin, have created online artworks which are critically responding to tracking technologies, vocal cloning, and the subjective nature of AI algorithms. So the conversation that we're having here is really at the heart of what we do at the Open Data Institute. So I think in terms of the challenges and potential solutions to bringing art and AI together, first of all, artists have been responding to new technology forever, from the chemistry of painting through to all the art movements throughout the 20th century, responding to modernism and the new spaces and tools and places that industry creates. And the AI and data world are no different. So one of the big challenges, and perhaps the solution is within this challenge, is finding a shared language. I think there's also a really important project to happen, to occur, which is finding the difference that makes the difference in terms of perspective. So there's often specialists and non-specialists will have a very different perspective of the same thing. So an artist who is very critically aware of working with the implications of AI may not understand all the conceptual details at the heart of, the software at the lower level, whereas someone who is a computer scientist will be able to bring their attention to that. So, but nevertheless, that many artists who we work with are software developers as well and work with software in a very conceptual way, but finding that shared language where people can push each other's perceptions and challenge them feels to me one of the answers to that.
Thank you very much. Millie, do you want to go next?
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yep, so my name's Millie Zimmerter and I'm Head of Public Policy at the ODI. Before I started working in data and digital technology a few years ago, I trained as an academic philosopher where I specialised in philosophy of art. So I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. In terms of thinking about the challenges and maybe potential solutions to bringing art and AI together, it seems to me to pick up on Hannah's point about, kind of finding a shared language. So yes, it could be about a shared language, but it also could be about learning each other's language, right? And so that takes time and it takes effort and it takes kind of working outside your comfort zone and sort of an area that you might not have been trained in, or it might have been a long time since you last revisited it. And that's in both directions, from the arts and from the technologists. And it's not just about the technical language for me. I think it's also about expectations and culture. So for example, in the sciences and in technology, we think a lot about reproducibility, about being able to get the same result again and again, and that's seen as being reliable and transparent. And we talk about, making your idea scalable, so it being able to be kind of, expanded and made standardized for use in lots of different situations or with lots of people. And of course, art is very often the opposite. You don't necessarily want it to be reproducible. You want it to be unique. You want it to be bespoke. You want it to exist in a moment in space and time, perhaps. So these are not just different technical languages, but maybe different sort of goals or different mindsets about the work that you do. But I think also the opportunities are really important. And there I'd speak to intellectual curiosity, and I think that both technologists and artists are communities who are committed to innovation in its different forms, whether that's innovation methods or innovation outcomes. And these are both communities who are comfortable being at the bounds of what is known and what is possible. And they want to stay at that kind of cutting edge. They want to stay at the forefront, slightly ahead of the rest of society. And ultimately, these are people who are kind of motivated by the work itself, right? You get the satisfaction from the work that you're doing, from creating and from making. And I think that's something really powerful that they both have in common.
Thank you very much, Millie. That was great. Huuk, how about you?
Hello, yes. So I've been in charge of managing research on technology for artists for all my career, more specifically about sound and music. And so, yes, my work is basically to develop technologies for artistic production. And so, of course, we have now all the possibilities of AI made available to artists. And so it raises many specific aspects, in particular, the complexity of that technology, of deep learning technology, etc., and how artists can manage that. Also, of course, how can artists have access to labeled databases that they can use for learning in these systems, etc. And so there is now a very big complexity of these systems. But here I speak about tools for the technology dedicated to artistic expression, whereas in MediaFutures, actually, we promote the roles of artists for innovation, and it relates to a program that was already mentioned in that panel, that is the STARTS program of the EU, which actually promotes the intervention of artists for innovation. And so this is exactly the opposite. That is, how can artists contribute to technological innovation? And this requires specific processes, and we organize that in MediaFutures also. And I would say that something very important to have in mind is that the way we manage the roles of persons must preserve the originality and the specificity of artistic work. That is, the artist is not only a subcontractor at the service of innovators, but really the artist has to develop an artwork, and then we must help also the artist to promote that artwork in cultural venues. And so this is very important, I think, for the role of artists. And then there is also, in relation to AI, there is also an issue on information on legal aspects. As soon as you manage information, of course, artists must be aware of all specific aspects related, of course, to copyright, but also to management of private data, etc. And in MediaFutures, we organize training sessions on all these aspects. So that's basically what I see as major challenges in the relation between AI and art.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to pass on to Deja and Anya, who I think also want to share something.
Yes, and just a heads up, as we're two people, we're taking advantage of our 6 combined minutes to speak about this. And we're very excited to be here and along with this panel. So I think to start, Deja and my practice combines creative technology, performance art, and environments. And today we're going to kind of answer the question by showing how we've used data, AI, or machine learning in past projects. And I think one thing to start is in responding to the idea of challenges, there seems to be a lot of hype around the idea of using AI to make something feel really cool or really relevant or really modern. And I think one of the traps that Deja and I always want to be aware of is using the novelty of a technology to give the work meaning and to make it say something. Sorry, I'm not feeling really well today. So you want to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just move to our slides. So,
one more thing.
Yeah.
So we always kind of ask ourselves, like as an exercise generally in our practice, when the technology is no longer novel, will the work still hold up? And if the answer is no, then we wouldn't use technology in that instance. And I think when you look at the works of art in the past that have used technology, but that you don't look at now and you're like, that's lame. If you look at Nam June Paik, for example, no one was like, wow, a television, like the technology of the television is amazing. And that's why people liked it. They liked it because of what he did with it, what he was saying with it, how it was, put into an experience. And so I think that's something that we always are really, really aware of. As we say, tech doesn't age well, but concepts do.
Right.
So using technology, and particularly with AI and data, making sure it's grounded conceptually, it's actually used because it's pushing the message forward, it's making the piece stronger, it's not just to be able to say that we used AI.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was Hannah that said it, that this is nothing new, artists working with new technologies. And I think this is important to understand. I think we, even if we look at the rich history of experiments of art and technology, I think it was around 1967, an initiative that took Cold War engineers as well as Bell Laboratory engineers and paired them with the contemporary artists of that time. We see how fruitful this collaboration can be, how artists can push engineers to think of ways to make technology work, not in how Millie, you were saying, to work for the aims and the purposes of, say, an engineer, or just for it to have a good design principle, for it to simply work. But artists have, different aims that might be different than the creators of the technology. And there are 3 projects that we just want to quickly go over. And a lot of the technology that we use in this project were created for very different means than what we used it for. And I think that's really important to highlight here because there's 2 reasons for that. One, our most sophisticated technologies have been developed by military and also for-profit interests, and therefore what those technologies can do reflect the aims. And for us as artists, it's important to use those technologies only when it's creatively conceptually grounded, but also if we're using problematic technologies, which on this first project we'll share what we use, that we are using it critically and we're using it to highlight why these technologies are subversive. So quickly, let's just move into OnView, because I know that we don't have a lot of time. So OnView, and you can see my screen, my browser. Okay, great. So OnView, it was commissioned by the SCAD Museum of Art. This is one of our large-scale works dealing with surveillance capitalism and how selfie culture and our lives on social media intertwine with surveillance capitalism and addictive interfaces and our incessant need to use technology. So here you can see that OnView is a it takes the user through 3 phases, or what we'd like to rather call an audience participant, through 3 phases. We have a terms and condition room, which is basically an immersive contract that the audience participant has to sign. And then they move on to, you can see some images here from that entry room. So you're standing in this contract is kind of like if a Cheshire cat wrote a TNC.
Alice in Wonderland is very important.
Right. So we say on view terms and conditions. So our terms and our condition, intentionally leaving out the S.
Because we're speaking about the human condition.
Yes. And then we go on that the artist will take your likeness and use it in the art and so forth. How do I exit out of that? Okay, and then the second area is the Stages Gallery. The Stages Gallery is kind of a theoretical parallel to kind of the selfie stage, and there's 2 where the exhibition photographs you, but we will only photograph you if you're in a particular position. And this is interesting, I think, for us to our relationship of wanting to be seen, the generational desire to be seen in
as the subject of the artwork that you're going to see.
Exactly. And then the last one is the Golden Gallery, which we'll get to in a second. But what's interesting about this project is that we as it relates to AI, data, and also machine learning, is that the entire structure of this project uses IoT and the idea of ubiquitous computing technically in the work. So we use Touch Designer as a main brain, integrating over dozens and dozens of microprocessor devices. So as the audience participant is moving through the space, we are, could you plug in the computer over there, sorry, that we are tracking the audience and collecting data about the audience, which we told you in the terms and condition that you signed in the beginning. And this is a closed system, so this information is not readily available and connected to outside of the experience itself, but we use facial recognition as well in order to create a user profile of that audience participant throughout the space. So we're learning about you as you go throughout. When you end the experience in the Golden Gallery, you see your face brings up your image in the gold frame, and we do this by facial recognition. And
so there's this moment then when you get to the end and you stand on the sensor that's in the floor, that little camera right above the gold frame picks up on your face. It's been building a user profile for you as you've gone through the space, just thinking you're getting your photo taken. And then suddenly you are the subject of the artwork in the gold frame on view behind bulletproof glass. And so there's this moment where like you're kind of creeped out because you're like, how did it know that it was me? And then you realize that they were tracking you and they knew which image was yours because it was using facial detection. And so it was kind of like a way to show, I love, Deja said this in one talk. She's like, we wanted to just show that if an art installation can do this, what could a government do with these same technologies that are available? And I think that's something that's really important and that is a big crutch of OnView.
Yeah, and like lastly, to speak to some of the problematic nature of the tools that, one of the tools that we use, we did this to call attention to the issue of facial recognition. We also needed to use it technically, but we didn't have endless resources in order to, use deep learning and machine learning to train data sets using millions of images. That isn't, something that we can create on our own. But what we ended up doing is using the dlib Python library, which was developed for the military, probably for surveillance and weapons as well. And so I think this is interesting because a lot of the tools that artists use and are available, TensorFlow, OpenAI, there's a lot of tools that were built in problematic ways. And so I think it's important, if artists are using those tools, that this is kept in mind, and that you're using your artwork to kind of present and expose the issues. Another project which we'll just touch on very quickly is Automatiste. I think this one is interesting and let me just share a different screen real quick. this project is a project that we did for London Fashion Week just a few months ago. And this is interesting because one of the questions that we're addressing here in this conversation today is that can we bring the idea of IA is a thing as well, but AI as well, AI art to and data-driven art to other audiences. And here is a fashion audience where we presented a highly technical artwork where we took the collection images and of textures and details, and we had like our sort of conscious lookbook and your literal lookbook. We also created a machine learning interpretation of the lookbook as well. And the only reason that we did this is because it fit with the concept, right? Going back to what Anya was saying earlier, it's very important that we just don't use tech for novel's sake. This project was grounded in automatic art and
it's realist automatism. And so we wanted to make this parallel between your mind trying to make sense of images and input, and in the same way taking pictures of the clothes from the collection and using GANs to express this kind of like subconscious machine dreaming and trying to interpret and make sense. But if that wasn't the concept of the collection, I don't think we would have used GANs to express it. So here's a couple of the GANs.
Yeah.
Slide 14.
Yep. And I'm just going to share. So I think, actually, I think we can move on while I'm sharing this to soft evidence.
And finally, our MediaFutures project we're working on.
To move on to Matthew.
What's that?
We also need to move on to Matthew.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that, and I'm sure we'll touch on
We'll get
the
on
rest
this
of
later.
this. Yeah, thank you.
I'd love to hear about it all day because I find it so fascinating. But let's see if we can build some of that into your answers to the questions later. Okay. Thank you so much. Matthew, last but not least, what's your take on this?
Hi, I'm Matthew. Yeah, so I'm looking at art, especially from the perspective of psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and just sort of keeping in the nature of these esoteric backgrounds I think we all have. I started as an artist, studied the philosophy of information, and now I'm doing the psychology side of things. And of course, I'm very interested in how we respond to art, and also the processes of how we make it and conceive it and how these sort of come together. I will say right now I'm coordinating a Horizon 2020 project where we're trying to apply art and research to the topic of, can we transform society? Can we make people's lives better? Can we change attitudes? Which, if you just want to talk about collaborating between art and sciences, raises all sorts of questions of finding common dialogue and boy, there's a lot of normative questions in there, and we're sort of dealing with that right now. But in terms of AI, I'll just briefly mention two things that I'm interested in. So one, I'm very interested in the aspect of empathy and emotional connections we make between a perceiver and an artist. And we do a lot of work working with artists and working with the perceivers and sort of seeing how they come together. And we find that, for example, making strong emotional, empathic connections with an artist is a good way to lead to, sort of powerful outcomes or change ideas and attitudes. And to some extent, if you remove the artist and add an AI, it still works. It doesn't really matter. And I think it raises all sorts of interesting ethical questions about what do we want art to do? What is the role of bots? And if people are just sort of naturally empathizing everything and making connections with the other, and you replace it with AI, it can be put to all sorts of purposes that maybe we can talk about. And then just in terms of big data, I would just briefly mention that one of the things we try to do in our lab is sort of take the point of departure that looking at only one line of data doesn't get you very far. You really have to look at patterns and start to put, how do people move and look and feel and think and put all that together, and it reveals really interesting patterns. And we do that, of course, with big data. And I'm happy to see some of the projects that were mentioned from the art side is sort of doing that and revealing patterns we may not know about. But it also raises, I think, all sorts of issues about who has access to the data and, to what extent are the traces we're leaving in the world ours or other people's. But I'll stop there and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. All right, so I've already said it in the chat. If you have any questions for any of the panelists on any of these topics, please post them and we'll get to them at the end. For now, though, I would like to start with a question that sort of touches on what Hannah and Millie have said and some of the others have reinforced around the different languages and the different ways how artists speak and how innovators speak and how this comes together. And I'm wondering, if it is so complicated, what is the value for artists and for innovators to work together and to tackle these issues together? What does either side stand to gain, and maybe what does it need in terms of support to enable these collaborations? I'd like to start with Hannah and then maybe Elena to give an answer on that.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'll be really quick. I think the big thing is bringing a sort of 360-degree perspective that is rooted from a very different perspective. Because, you know, when we've got an idea about something, when we think we know something, you just have to shift your perception a little bit away into a different direction and into a different context. And what you think you know can be completely blown apart. So, you know, Deirdre and Anya mentioned Bell Labs, you know, these extraordinary projects where artists were brought to work alongside engineers meant people were asking each other really challenging questions that didn't come from each other's worlds and that challenged each other's worlds. So I mentioned DocsBox, one of the ODI commissions that came through our R&D program in the last couple of years. So we've been actually not with your department, Geffion and Elena, but working with a different department in King's to explore how people think about cybersecurity and whether experiencing information about cybersecurity through art projects is different than experiencing it through sort of more standard information. And we did some interviews where people took part in this performance art work with Alistair Gentry and the scientists we're working with. It's an interdisciplinary group of scientists, I should say, so cybersecurity specialists, psychology specialists. And the first thing they did was get transcripts of the interviews, and they got some really interesting data from that. But then when they presented that to me and Alistair, who had been the people who had been interviewing the people, because the interview was a performance, we were like, we absolutely have to be measuring non-verbal cues as well. And they were like, wow, yeah, absolutely. So, but that hadn't been part of their process. So we've shared process, and their process was a process we never would have thought of either. So I'll let someone else pick up.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Elena is with us at the moment. Her camera is off. So Matthew, do you have a...
I am. I was tweeting about this panel. So what do I think is the why bother? That was the question, right? Say I think, like, just very briefly, I just don't. So and I acknowledge very much what colleagues on the panel who know a lot about arts, much more than me, have said before. So AI is just one of the most recent technology innovations that artists are using or playing with. At the same time, I think we just building bridges between different communities and disciplines is hard. And I think we're now more aware of the added value, but it's not a one battle. And I think we need to keep doing it, and we need to learn more about how to do it better. And we need to share the experiences and the lessons we've learned and the resources, because it is hard, and it is much more tempting to just stay in your own discipline and propose a solution that you know very well, that your peers will understand immediately and perhaps will agree with. So I think the sort of challenges that we have taken on, lots of them affect the whole world. Lots of them require open approaches, and I think we've passed the stage where we could just propose single discipline solutions to them. So even if we wouldn't enjoy the ride, which I do, I think it's the only way to move forward.
Thank you. Matthew, I've seen you nodding the whole time, and Anya, happy for you to go next, if that's okay.
Sorry, to me or to
Matthew, and then Anya, and then we'll move on.
I will just agree with, I think, everything that has been said to this point. Yeah, I will say that sort of in keeping in this vein of AI, there's something special about it. One thing we find from the science side of things too is that there's this penchant to say, well, the computer told me this, so it must be true. Which I think I know was mentioned in the arts as well. And I was really happy to see it framed in almost exactly the same terms I would have used to describe, say, psychology. You know, we did a machine learning, we found a pattern. This one must be true because the computer found it, which of course raises all sorts of issues of well, what was the algorithm you were using to find it, and what were the assumptions and all sorts of things that are sort of pushed under the carpet, so to speak, quite often, which I think needs to be put out in the open and discussed.
Thank you. Anya, Deja?
Yeah, just speaking to the idea of, again, as was already said, that these like multifaceted issues need, I think, multi-pronged solutions as well. And I love what Elena said in the intro about that there's like a meme that might travel and like completely permeate culture, and thinking that we can have, just lawmakers at the table trying to decide what to do, versus one of the most poignant arguments and summaries I've ever heard of US gun policy was an Australian comedian who like explained the absurdity of it in like 30 seconds. And so it's like thinking about bringing artists, bringing stand-up comedians to the table that can look at something and just be like, this is absurd and this would resonate with people in 1 second. And in meme culture, to get them to register something, I think is really important, because it's the attention spans are getting worse. It's so many things are, engagement driving. And I think to kind of attack that while being aware that you're kind of having to like play that game is the only real way to fight the way that, false and mis and disinformation is spreading.
And I think that the example you gave of a succinct and effective, immediate way to communicate these issues by comedians, artists, and other disciplines outside of the immediate sector dealing with data and technology is super important, given that also law and legal structures cannot keep up.
They take forever
with technology. So, I mean, in the meantime, the word has to get out. And I think having art being another entry point for the subject matter is important.
And I was just saying affect and seeing feeling as a way of learning as well.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move on to our next, to another topic then that some of you have already touched on in some of the things you've said, and especially around all of the challenges around arts and AI. And I would like to hear from you about the ethical considerations that artists or innovators or collaborations between those two need to take when they use data to create art, not only in terms of the data that goes in, but also the data that comes out, which is probably something that Anya and Catherine have a lot to say about as well. But I'd like to start with Millie, who hasn't had a chance to speak on this topic yet.
Yeah, thank you. So at the ODR, we've got this tool called the Data Ethics Canvas, and it's just a kind of framework or set of critical questions that you can ask yourself about a data project to evaluate for yourself whether or not you're kind of making the right decisions along the way. And it tries to go from the kind of the project lifecycle, from even before you start the project, thinking about what you intend it to achieve, right through to thinking about the outputs and the outcomes, what happens as a result of the data collection and analysis. And it's just a tool for critical thinking, and we use it ourselves in our own data projects. So that's and I think the emphasis on it being a tool for critical thinking is it's hopefully adaptable and hopefully can last a long time. But I think what's specific to the arts is with an artwork, there is an expectation by the audience that they can interpret it in their own ways, in ways that are beyond the artist's control or intention. And also an artwork has both a kind of potentially unforeseen longevity and range. Our artworks kind of travel across borders, or kind of linger in the public imagination in a way that can be quite unexpected or unpredictable, in the way that, say, a report might not. So I think that's the thing that's quite difficult to capture with your standard sort of data ethics tool, is the way that art itself is intended to be adapted by the audience, and that the consequences of that are entirely unpredictable.
Thank you. I would like to give the word to Hugo next. I assume you have seen quite a lot of this in your long career in this space.
Yes, but actually I'm not a specialist of ethics, right? So, and data is a very broad concept. I would say it depends, of course, on the data you manage. But, well, first, I would say that often artworks consist in repurposing existing content. And of course, it's up to the artist to master that aspect. And also here, when we use user data, of course, there are all the aspects of should we provide the names of the concerned people? It's very important if we manage misinformation, of course, that all people who diffuse that information are mentioned, but we must also manage user anonymization, etc. But I think that there is no much specificity of artists in that process, because now with internet, anybody can publish information and anybody is concerned with these issues of ethics, I would say. So for me, I don't see, of course, it's part of the questioning of the artist on his her own work ethics, but I don't see a specificity of artists in that aspect.
Thank you. Deja, Anya, do you have something to add to that from your perspective?
I think this is actually a good chance to briefly talk about how we're kind of incorporating our consideration for data ethics into our MediaFutures project that we're doing, which is called Soft Evidence. And this piece is specifically around deepfakes. And so in this process, looking at data sets that exist, how deepfakes are usually made, how they're usually, people are scraped. One kind of disturbing fact we've come across is that over 90% of detected deepfakes are used for revenge porn. So it's also a massive gender issue kind of embedded into this technological threat, but obviously it has a lot of other implications. So essentially what we've decided to do is use deepfakes, which in the absence of a malicious intent is just synthetic media. We're making a series of synthetic media depicting scenes that never happened. And in order to we did look at the data ethics canvas because we did one of the ODI trainings, which was great. And we kind of decided to go to the extreme of creating our entirely own data sets. So every single thing that's being used to create our deepfakes, we're taking every single image, we're shooting all of the content ourselves. And then also to kind of draw attention to the politics of naming, the politics of classification. We're also working with our subjects to ensure that they actually consent to the labels that are being applied to their likeness. So I think a lot of times people think that data is just over there and neutral, but the classifications, the naming, it's all so political and there's so much subjectivity in there. So I think in the creative process, even the naming of the data, how it's classified, we're drawing attention to that as part of the creative act of creating a piece of synthetic media.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the extraction of the data being, is that consensual? Is it consensual that, or how the data is classified? Is it ethical? Okay, that's another consideration, but also has the person who's the data is about, have they consented to that particular classification? So this is also something that we're looking at.
Hannah?
Thank you. That's so wonderful to hear about. Just, I would say that from my observations of working with artists in this field for, 30 years and even 20 years ago, a commission I made was artists working with machine learning and the way machines see things against a different set of criteria than we do. Artists have consistently been asking the questions about where the human is. So for example, AM Dark, who we're about to launch a new online commission with at the ODIs, question that they set themselves with this was the machines are learning, but who are the teachers? And the things we're seeing, which Deja and Anya have just brought back, time and time again, the artists are bringing the human back into it, interrogating this issue of consent. I've seen some really advanced, for want of a better word, questions coming from artists about consent. It's not like I'm not seeing that in the technical world. Of course not. Our chairman, Nigel Shadbolt, talks about this week in the press, for the ODI chairman. But I think that it's been a really big concern for artists to recognise that the tools are made by humans, for humans, the collecting is done by humans, the subjective decisions what not to collect is done by humans. And they've been really banging the drum for a long time about the insufficiencies in that, the deficiencies in that process.
Thank you for that. I would maybe like to move on to another question then, because given that we're hosting this workshop from MediaFutures, and one of the focuses that we have in the project is misinformation specifically, I would like to hear your thoughts about how artists can use data specifically to tackle misinformation as a problem, maybe what they need to be enabled in order to do that, what data, what skills, what resources are needed, and what barriers are there that we may have to overcome with innovation programs like ours. I think Anya and Deja probably have something to say to go first.
Sure. Well, I'll first talk about technical barriers. So, I mean, my background is in human-computer interaction. So designing systems, I already have a basis for that. And I think that is an important part, but I think even you don't, as an artist, you don't necessarily need extensive programming experience, but I think it is a good thing to do, an important thing to do, to try to understand how to communicate with engineers. And so even if you're not going to be the best machine learning expert in the world, at least having this understanding of how to speak to engineers is I think key and important. But I think the technical knowledge is one aspect, but there's also there's a community, and there are a lot of open source tools to break down that barrier. And more, there's more tools, for instance, like Runway ML, where you don't need any coding experience at all, and you can use machine learning in your practice. But the other thing is access to engineers and resources, and these take a considerable amount of funding. So if you don't have access to an engineer, and if you don't know how to do it yourself, or even a lot of our projects where we are technically savvy and it's part of our native practice, we still need 20 people on a team to execute it. So we need a budget in order to execute this. So I think, it's an expensive medium. And I think knowledge is part of it, and support from organizations and programs like MediaFutures are really solving this problem, I think. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hugo, I wonder what you have to add from your perspective, having worked with artists in this context.
Yes, actually, I completely agree. And at IRCAM, we have a category of people that we call computer music designers, who are responsible for the technical management of an artistic project, actually. And this is very important, I think, for artists to have technical mentors that implement these complex technical aspects. So this is, of course, one important aspect. But more specifically about problematics of misinformation, I would say that, and so we receive many applications in MediaFutures actually by artists who are in countries that are not necessarily full democracies, right? And who have actually a message to the world, and who would like to use art as medium of transmitting that message. And I would say that there are two main gaps that I see. The first is access to information, and more specifically about tools that enable to identify and characterize misinformation from informational databases, which is quite a complex process, of course, technical process. And then there is the issue of exposure beyond traditional media, because if traditional media are managed by the government, and so they don't necessarily transmit I would say the right information, then through which channels artists can express themselves. Of course, they can publish things on the web, but maybe they will not have big exposure. And so I think it's also a mission of a project like MediaFutures to organize also circuits of dissemination and diffusion of the artistic works to broad targets.
Thank you so much. Hannah, did you have a take on this? And then Millie?
I think I'll let Millie go ahead. I think she'll have more to say.
All right.
Thanks. Maybe not more to say, but I'm really desperate to geek out on some philosophy here. So just on, kind of on art, kind of countering misinformation. So I'm a big fan of Richard Rorty, and in his book, Contingency, Irony and Solidarity, he says, well, look, it's not really the job of art to kind of argue, right? It's not the job of art to kind of make claims or counterclaims about truth or facts. And one of the things that art can do is cultivate a sense of empathy and a sense of intimacy with other people, right? You don't win moral arguments through logic. You win moral arguments, so to speak, by cultivating a sense of empathy, and then you don't want to hurt other people if you can empathize with them. And he says that's what a lot of the kind of great art does in quite subtle ways. It allows you to see the other as yourself, and through that, what he calls solidarity, right? You kind of have a sense of kinship with other aspects of humanity. So I'm not so keen on the idea of using art to kind of counter misinformation, but maybe art, one of the things that art can do is cultivate intimacy. Art can also do the opposite, of course. And I'm not going to say that the role of art is to make us better people. I don't believe that either. But there's a really great, one of my favorite kind of collections of essays is by Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet. And when he was Professor of Poetry at Oxford, his inaugural lecture was published as a book, The Redress of Poetry. And it's just the most wonderful lecture. But what he does is he goes through all the meanings of redress, the word redress, from the redress of poetry, and talks about how, the things that poetry can do in society. And most of us think that redress means, the kind of setting the record straight, correcting the moral balance, or you kind of repaying kind of, I guess, kind of justice after harm that has been done. And he says, yeah, poetry can do all of those things. But my favorite meaning that he pulls out is a kind of, really old one. I think it's a medieval one. And it's the sound of the horn that changes the direction of the hunt. And it brings the hounds or the deer to the proper course. And I'm going to read aloud from it. He says, look, in this meaning of redress, there is no hint of ethical obligation. It is more a matter of finding a course for the breakaway of innate capacity, a course where something unhindered yet directed can sweep ahead into its full potential. And I love that meaning of redress, the horn that calls us back to a different course so we can fulfill our potential. So I think that's, that's the way that he was thinking about poetry. And I think that's what we can think about art in the age of misinformation, and it's kind of called society to change direction in a way that allows us to fulfill our potential, maybe. But then related to that, the second part of your question was about how artists can be enabled to do this work. And I'd say beyond the kind of access to technology and technologists, perhaps there's something there around access to those who are affected by the use of data and digital tech. And again, I suppose this is that redressing point about kind of redressing the balance of perspectives and whose point of view we consider. And I think it's also important not to kind of deify or fixate upon the technology or the technologists, but think about everyone around them. And maybe that's part of what art can do in engaging with misinformation.
Thank you so much. That is, I'm going to pick up on that in just a moment. I just want to give Matthew the opportunity to say a word on this if you want to.
Yeah, fascinating. I think I would pick up on the point of art being put to making the world better. And I think I totally agree, as long as the caveat being, I don't agree with the argument that, art shouldn't have a purpose and doesn't have a purpose and it's for its own sake. I think there's always a purpose. But one of my favorite quotes is by Dave Hickey, where he talks about, well, wouldn't it be better if we talked about art not as penicillin, but more like cocaine, where it could be bad for us? And we should just have a little bit, or, use it in moderation, and really interesting things might happen. So I think just in this entire vein of I like the idea of the using art to course correct, if you will. For me, one of the more interesting things is, that I think art has a really powerful ability to reveal what we take for granted and reveal what is, normal and the way everyone always acts, and says, well, is it really that way? Is that really so normal? What are we doing in this case? And I think with all of these topics we're talking about today, I think art can really make an interesting view into some of these topics. But I'll let you go into the next question.
Thank you so much. We would technically now be somewhere at the point where we would like to take audience questions, but we haven't got any yet. So just a reminder for our participants, for our audience, if you have any questions, please drop them on Hoover and I will pick them up. But for now, I will just keep going because I find this so fascinating. I'm just going to combine two of the questions that I had somewhat prepared up front, based off, as I just said, what Millie said about access to the affected. And I was wondering, what is it that makes data-driven art specific, or a specific experience for the audience? And in combination with that, we know that digital and data literacy across the population, across Europe, is still a big, big problem, especially when it comes to misinformation, but also in general. And so I wonder, how accessible is data-driven art, and how easily can it be consumed? And does it need a minimum level of education, of skill set to be understood, or does it transcend those boundaries? I think maybe Anja and Deja might want to pick that up first, and then we move from there.
Yeah, can I just, first of all, I love everything, Millie, that you said, and I agree with it so much. And it makes me feel better about Deja and my decision in making the series of synthetic media, where like everything, when people hear deep fakes, they think of like the Tom Cruise thing or a politician. And we're like, we are completely avoiding anything that looks political whatsoever. Like our scenes are going to be more like something from a Roy Anderson, like very slow cinema, very beautiful, poetic. You're like, why am I looking at this? It's stunning, but I don't get it. So we took this approach of being like, we want to take a very politically charged kind of like problem and message, but wrap it and use it as a medium to convey something that just might be beautiful and even meditative. Because I even think about like my family members that voted for Trump, and I'm like, we might both be able to stand in front of this and like it, it's not going to trigger one of us to be like, that's on their side. And so I think this idea of speaking to politics and using it as a course correct, or like a neutral ground to feel something in common with someone who's coming from a very different place, is very powerful.
Yeah, the feeling, Millie, I also was just,
I loved the reading.
We need to have a sidebar conversation for a few hours about this. So, but I think even in the project that we showed earlier, and we went through a lot of technical details and all of this meaning and everything it was about, but when it was up for 3 months at the museum, and when people went through, they didn't, a lot of people ask, well, when we give presentations about it, did the audience understand all of this that you're telling us now in this hour-long presentation? And I think the answer is maybe not, and probably not, but they had a feeling. And then this feeling, I remember in the opening night, someone came out on the other end and said, well, that was a feeling, and and because it is an immersive art, and it's important to immerse people, not just physically or just sort of, engage with their sort of intellectual senses, but more importantly, their emotional and the sort of psychological elements at play too. And in order to feel something, in order to like feel, hey, I have a gut feeling about this. Where is that taking me? And I think that is a critical part. And no, I don't think that you need a certain level of education in order to experience a AI or data-driven artwork.
Anna, you're shaking your head vigorously.
Oh, because I agree with her. I don't think you need. I think that there are very many different levels to encountering an artwork that is engaged with technology like this. And some data-driven art might need explaining, and that's okay. And some data-driven art won't need explaining, like any other work. Basically, if you walk up to any painting in the Tate or any gallery in the town you live in, there's going to be a level of engagement that's a pure visceral body response, visual response, sensory visceral response. And, I kind of think that's a first level. And then there's the level where you know a little bit about it and you're like, oh yeah, I get that. And then there's the deeper level of scholarly engagement. And that's the case with data art as well. But I think that there are times when having being able to understand how a creative person, be that an artist or a designer doing data visualization, is telling stories with that data. I think that's another interesting thing to think about. So, for example, we invited a photographer, a photographic artist, Natasha Caruana, to be artist in residence at ODI. And she was not someone who saw herself as working with data, but in fact, we had seen in her work, through her analysis of sort of the distributed image and social media imagery and the like, we saw that she was kind of engaging with data. And she created a new work at the ODI, having spent a long time researching the data around divorce. She made a film, but if you experience this work, you see a couple dancing in their wedding clothes in Hastings, which is a seaside town in the UK, with the sea crashing behind them. And in order to walk through to that film, you walk through a curtain made up of pawned and discarded wedding rings. And she collected those wedding rings from the towns that statistically have the highest divorce rates. And the number of rings was approximately 1% of the data of the divorces in the UK in that year. And the dance they were performing was an interpretation of the data behind divorce, including codependency, gambling. They were slapping each other's hands. You wouldn't have known that looking at the work. There was a lot of story in it. What you experienced was a very powerful, emotional, relational work, but it was all there to unravel. So I think that any time an artist gets to use the critical tools from any industry, whether that's data or any other technology, it is like giving them a sort of backstage pass to the spaces that that industry creates. And what we've talked about already a lot is that artists are then exploring the many ways that humans might inhabit these spaces, you know, sort of comfortably or uncomfortably. So that's a bit of a vague response, but that is my response.
Thank you for that. Matthew, I wonder if you found any of this in your research?
First of all, as seems to be keeping in course of what we're doing, I fully agree. I do think there's these levels of mediation. I think, yeah, one of the more interesting aspects is if there's something about the piece that sort of pulls you in and makes this engagement, and then you know, sort of being led on to, well, then you can start to understand these layers of meaning, and you know, what does this curtain of rings mean, and what do these dance moves mean, and sort of start to add layers and layers of meaning is one of the more fascinating things of what art can do. Just to throw out another example, maybe it's art. There's a colleague of mine who's an anthropologist and spends summers doing digs in Northern Africa. And they had some funding to ask a poet to accompany them. And this poet actually didn't speak English, but all of the researchers spoke English. So that this person just spent the entire 2 months just documenting everything they were saying to each other, not understanding really what they were talking about. And then made this long poem just with these statements, or you know, the sound of the statements. And the anthropologist said it was just fascinating because you didn't realize what your life was like day in and day out, and what sort of conversations and things you would just constantly say to each other. And in my mind, I think that's one of the more fascinating things that, say, big data can do. You know, it's an observer of our everyday activity, and sort of framed in a palatable form that we can readily make a connection to. Yeah.
Thank you. Millie or Hugues, does one of you want to add something to this, or shall we move on?
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, okay. Of course, many has been said already about that, but I could use many other words. First, the fact that the artworks carries a new meaning, and through also specific channels, by using sensory modalities. And so that is the support of the artwork is not merely language and mind, but it's sensory modalities. And it's theorized for engineers with visualization and sonification aspects, but I think the artwork carries something more, which is the aesthetics, which is very, very important. So I think this is one aspect, and that contributes also to speak to people who don't have that technical literacy. Maybe also something in sociology that would speak to you, Giffion. The situational reception of an artwork is different from the one of reception of information in our usual lives. of course. And maybe when you are in a cultural venue or confronted to an artwork, your openness is not the same. And you may receive also something that you don't receive when you are in front of your computer, right? So this is one aspect. And I think also something I saw in all applications in MediaFutures is that, of course, the artwork and the artistic experience, I could say, is the support for an involvement of the subject, either alone, for instance, by being confronted by videos, for instance, by Terra and Anya, but also the support or link with other people. And we have several projects that organize social links between people. For instance, there is a project called Social Sandwich that manages exchanges between people of different opinions. And all the process is managed through this artistic experience. And so this is very interesting because it made people speak together, and these people would have never spoken together instead. So I think the artwork carries an experience also, and this is very important also.
Thank you. Yes.
We could speak of that, of course, for 4 hours, right?
No, that's very good. Thanks. Millie, I wasn't certain. Did you want to add something?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. So I think it's interesting that, we often tend to sort of think about digital literacy and analytic capability. And I think that's very much a reflection of, how sort of European society is structured, right? Because there's more than one kind of capability or literacy at stake. You could think about emotional capability, emotional literacy, all sorts of different kinds of literacy that could be relevant here. So I think that's really, really important to think about different kinds of literacy, different kinds of attainment beyond academic, technical, analytic, and not favour that over other kinds. I also don't think people's abilities are fixed, whether that is emotional literacy or analytic literacy, right? And so that's something that we need to kind of work with and allow that people change and grow. And I also think the best art rewards re-engagement. So even if you have someone who's kind of, highly literate in lots of different dimensions of intelligence, they're still going to get something different every time they return to an artwork. So it's not a kind of, here's your chance, did you understand it, game overs. We keep on, it's a dialogue. So I'm a bit more optimistic about that. So I can't speak to what other people sort of, value about data-driven art, but I can speak to what I have loved about the works that Hannah has curated for the Data as Culture program at the ODI. So I love the way that they speak to my everyday life, whether that's smartphones or social media or computer games, and they kind of give the everyday back to me sort of transformed and sort of not made, it's art, but it's not other. It doesn't have the formality that I sometimes associate with art. I love the way that they interrogate data and digital technology without slipping into science fiction cliches. And in doing so, they also refresh the creative language of science fiction, and then I expect more from the science fiction genre as a result of these artworks and seeing how they reinterpret what can be done with data and digital technology and the creative imagination. And finally, I also love the way that they often tune into some of the geekier aspects of data or tech culture. And so I feel seen in all my data nerdiness and geekness. So I really love that bit too.
Thank you so much. It was pointed out that there is indeed one question in the chat, but I think it's a straight up request for more information for Dija and Anya to please post some of the URLs that I think were shown in your slide deck. So maybe you want to respond to that in the chat. I don't think it's sensible to read out URLs right here and now. We still don't have any other audience questions, so I'm just going to play the ball back to you and see if there's anything that you might want to explore in more depth from your fellow peers. Hannah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the kind of processes that you've evolved and where you've spent a long time bringing artists and engineers together and, negotiating, that collaboration. Are there any particular, particular advice you'd give if there are any artists watching or engineers watching who'd like to form a collaboration? What's the rule 101, or number one?
I would say number one is openness. Openness to the other, openness to different language, openness to different agenda. because an artist or an engineer, there is the opposition between generalization, which is the role of an engineer, and specificity of the artistic viewpoint and artwork. And this is very important to respect this opposition. And so this must be explained. Also, I think a general obstacle is specialization versus transdisciplinarity, as been said already, because the artist has a necessary transdisciplinary view on the process, and the artist doesn't care about discipline, and this is sometimes difficult to understand from people who are very formatted. My experience is that the process is actually much more easy for artists than for engineers, because artists must the technique is their material anyway, and so they must be documented on the technique. Whereas my experience is that often engineers don't have necessarily an artistic culture, and so they don't understand art. They go to the movie, they sometimes go to the museum, but maybe they don't understand what is the artistic process and what it brings, and so it needs explanation because. In order then to understand what is the real value of an artist. And it's, when you know what it is, of course, this must be much respected. And so then the role of organizations like MediaFutures is also to manage the balance of forces between the engineering, which is very strong, and the artists who can be isolated and small, and managing the balance so that the artist is respected for his or her own objectives, process, and then the issue is how to organize them to work together. So there are two joint processes, technology development process and an artwork developing process, and we must organize back and forth exchanges between them so that there is a joint innovation and artistic production process. So it's part of the answer, but I raised a number of issues.
Yeah,
there are probably many others.
You've made me think about, my background's in museums. I worked at the Science Museum in London for 17 years as an art curator. And what we found with visitor research is that people coming to the Science Museum expected to be told the truth, not the provisional truth, what the truth that was there to stay. And obviously that's not how scientists see science, but that's the perception culturally that people see it. Whereas the same visitors going to an art gallery would not expect to be presented with the truth. They'd be expected to be encouraged to come up with their own ideas. And I wonder if you think that what I've noticed in collaborations that I've mediated or engineered myself, that it's very difficult for someone who's a specialist already to sort of go back to square one and not be the specialist in a conversation. And I think there's something about our broader culture that we just need to hammer home the permission not to know and the permission to be a blank slate, I suppose.
Thank you. Deja, was that just a wave? Did you mean to say something?
Oh, I just wanted to ask if anyone has read Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI yet, and if that has changed anyone's perception on, she just kind of like goes into the physical, a lot of the like ethical concerns around basically the labor conditions that are required to make it work, Amazon's Mechanical Turk, like mining of rare earth minerals and all of this. And I'm just wondering, because we definitely have been like, is there a trap here where the art and culture sphere can kind of become a weird de facto marketing branch for AI and big tech? And I think that's something just to be aware of and that we're definitely thinking about now, and was wondering if anyone else has any thoughts about that.
I haven't read the book, but I think it's a massive risk. I think one of the issues is for artists to work with AI in a really deep level, not just responding to it. You need access to tools, and often the budget for that comes from a place that has a story to tell. So I think there's a huge risk for that. And I think that that's a really tricky, I don't think we can answer that in 2 minutes, but yes, risk, risk alert.
I would like, we only have 2 minutes left, but we actually have a question from the audience, which I'd just like to quickly throw out to you, which is amazing works that you have shown. Do you have some activities targeting kids and teens, eventually using social media or influencers to reach out of the happy few? I think that's probably primarily for Anya and Deja.
Not yet, but I think it's very interesting, and we've talked about the idea of creating works that are specifically like for younger age groups, realizing that these are part of like shaping the consciousness and the ideas of the world of future generations. We have friends that have daughters that are like 11 through 13, and just looking at what they're bombarded with, I think there's definitely a need for work that's speaking and thinking about those generations, definitely.
Right, and I actually feel that you know, because of the younger generations are digitally native, they're much more tech savvy than, like, I was talking to someone of Gen Z the other day, and someone had asked, well, is this too technically advanced? Like, will our audience be tech savvy enough? And she was like, we're all tech savvy, we're Gen Z, we're digitally native. Like, that isn't even a conversation, that is just a ridiculous question to even ask. So I think, like, you know, maybe some of these more complex projects are actually more understandable, you know, like the project as on View, for instance, could be in some way, you know, elicit more of a home response, given that, you know, they grew up with a certain level of literacy. But I think experiential learning through art and tied to a younger generation is very interesting, but we haven't had the opportunity yet.
Thank you so much. I'm going to leave it there for today. We're at the half of the hour, which is exactly where we wanted to end. So thank you all so much. It has been fantastic talking to you, and I hope our audience enjoyed it just as much as I did. I've posted some of the links for both MediaFutures and Deja and Anya's work in the chat on Hoover, where it is going to be accessible for a while after, if I understood correctly. So thank you all again. I hope to see more of you in the future. And Deja and Anya specifically, best of luck with your work on MediaFutures for the remainder of the program.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.